Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sophie Hackett, the curator of photography at the Art Gallery of Ontario, and it is my great pleasure today to be talking to the wonderful Laura Jones. I will tell you more about Laura in a moment, but first I would like to acknowledge that the AGO operates on land that is the territory of the Anishinaabe, Mississauga Nation, and was also the territory of the Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Toronto is also governed by a treaty between the federal government of Canada and the Mississaugas of the Credit, Anishinaabe Nation. Toronto, of course, has always been a trading center for First Nations. So about my wonderful guest today, Laura Jones, has led a long and rich and multifaceted life. She's based here in Toronto as a freelance writer, a photographer, and a community advocate. She's written a shelf full of articles, reports, newsletters, pamphlets, and even photographed 3 children's books. She's exhibited her photographs across Canada, from a laundromat in Labrador to a gallery in Vancouver. Laura's current project is gathering information about women working in photography in Canada before Confederation. And before our time is over, we'll get a chance to dive into that too. For those of you out there listening today, if you have a question, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen to ask any questions, and my wonderful colleagues will route them to us when the time is right. And finally, I'd like to send a big thank you to the TD Ready Commitment, our lead sponsor of talks and performances, for generously supporting this talk today. Hi, Laura.
Hi.
I'm going to share my screen and we're going to take a look at some pictures because there are a lot of pictures to talk about today. Here we are. So this is Baldwin Street. Those who've spent time in and around the Art Gallery of Ontario know Baldwin Street is just to the north of Dundas. It's very much the neighborhood that the gallery finds itself in. But Laura, would you tell us how you came to find a home on Baldwin Street in 1967, just well, over 50 years ago now?
Yeah. Well, actually, we were living around the corner on Beverly Street in a Rochdale house.
Right.
And it was very crowded. And we had so many people who were living in that house that we were taking baths at Harrison Baths, right 2 tiny blocks south of the AGO. And we were part of Company Young Canadians. And we had been hired to work in Toronto, but it wasn't specific as to where we would settle or even what we would do. And so when we were just walking around, we saw the for rent sign at 23 Baldwin Street, already knew the neighborhood, and moved in.
Wonderful. Of course, you came to Canada, so you were born in the US, and your
Yes.
husband at the time, John Phillips, was also born in the US. And you made the choice to leave the United States as part of a wider movement, and you weren't alone. Can you tell us a little bit about that moment and why you left?
Well, we were at a Quaker school. That's where John and I met. And most Quakers are need to do alternative service for 2 years instead of going into the military. And I had grown up knowing people who had been in a starvation unit as their alternative service to World War II, or smoke jumpers and all sorts of activities. So John actually went to his draft board with his application and actually said that he would be willing to go to Vietnam if he went as a photographer. Well, they weren't impressed at all by his portfolio and said they needed to make a man out of him. So they should send him to Vietnam, that they knew his father, who had died when he was young, and that was the best growing up task that they could do.
Wow. So they
So
rejected his application to be a
yes, they
conscientious
did. And
objector.
we appealed it, and we went through various processes and had a lawyer who was in Philadelphia, the draft board in Iowa, our school in New York, and kept going back and forth for months. But finally, a Ladies' Home Journal article had an article about Americans going to Canada. And it even had addresses where to go in Toronto for help. So we thought, well, let's look at it, like Canada. My grandmother was actually born in Canada, and my great grandparents were as well. So I did have a little bit of knowledge about Canada, but not in terms of moving and living there.
Mhm.
So we went to Expo first and wanted to hear AJ Musty, who was speaking in Expo, and he was a great peace advocate. And then we came to Toronto, and I think it was George Martel from This Magazine Is About Schools was one of the first people who we happened to meet. And he suggested we apply for the company Young Canadians. So we did, and we were accepted.
Um,
And that's really how we ended up here.
right. But you didn't, your sense of social justice, you did not leave that behind by any means. This is a photograph you took at a protest here in Toronto, right?
Yes, it is. But there were people in the US who I knew on both sides who felt that leaving the US to go to Canada was giving up on the movements that were already in progress in the US.
Right. Well, and coming to Canada wasn't without its without controversy either. Canadians were, you did face some anti-American sentiment as well. Or
Yes,
so
that was true. I didn't feel it on Baldwin Street, because Baldwin Street was an immigrant reception area, and there were people from lots of different countries who were already living there and moved there after us.
Mm.
So that it was kind of a wonderful experience, because the people who you were getting to know were, it's a very diverse community that we became a part of.
And we'll come back to that. I have some, well, we'll share some of your excellent photographs of the street itself and some of the people that lived there. Very quickly, so a couple of years, you arrive in Canada, in Toronto, well, in Canada in 1967, you settle on Baldwin Street. Here we have a picture of 23 Baldwin Street with the sign out front, the Baldwin Gallery of Photography, and the notice of you opening that day. I love the openness of it. The notice indicates photographers interested in showing their work should drop in or call. That's a kind of wonderful spirit of openness there. Why did it seem to you that opening a gallery of photography is the best way, or was what you wanted to do, was a way to, the work you wanted to follow?
Well, I fell into it. I had some experience working in a darkroom before I came and with photography, but John Phillips, my husband, was very close to Henry Wilhelm at East Street Gallery, and he had been
Which
involved,
was
both
in,
of them had been involved in East Street Gallery for quite a few years.
right, and that
In
gallery was in Iowa, where
Iowa.
John was from, right?
And so, yes, and Henry was making these archival print washers that were very high quality, handmade print washers and film washers. And so initially, one of the ideas would we would be selling those, and we did sell some in Canada, but it was going to be more of a sideline. And then Henry and Steve Wright, who was another close friend, actually came, they, between the two of them, they photographed every step of the leaving the US.
Wow.
So going to the draft board, going to North Carolina to see the people who I used to live with when I was about 14, going to where my mother lived, and just going through our lives. And then each step of going to the physical for the draft, and saying goodbye to people who we cared about in New York and in Washington. Henry covered all that plus crossing the border. So he actually spent off and on quite a few months just coming and documenting the whole process. So being the East Street Gallery in Iowa with Henry and the Baldwin Street Gallery in Toronto just sort of made sense because neither John or I had any particular skills other than photography.
Photography.
And
Not a negligible skill.
no, it's not, but it is, it's not really, well, a gallery, and maybe we even chose the wrong name for a gallery because it never limited itself to a gallery. And we chose that name really because East Street Gallery was on East Street in Iowa, so Baldwin Street Gallery would be on Baldwin Street in Toronto. So we did that. But new draft dodgers would sleep on the floor at the gallery. When they arrived, we were on a list as places for people to drop in if they needed accommodation. So they just slept on the floor. And this first exhibit is Henry Wilhelm, his girlfriend, Christina Newman, myself, and John Phillips. So we really kind of started with that combination. And I think we started at the same time selling the print washers. And having those print washers meant that we were in touch with a very unique group of people who cared about archival printing and fine printing. And many of them were helpful. We had things just on the wall like that, kind of taped to the wall, and Lionel Stevenson from Eastern Canada and Lauren Blunt, who lived in Toronto at the time, came and just decided they were going to build us a whole structure. So they built a structure with styrofoam and then covered it with burlap, bought us these little pins that had curves on them so we could just put up exhibits quickly and take them down quickly and always be having things on the wall. And there were just a lot of people who were interested in photography who just sort of came along and helped or took shifts in the gallery and participated in different ways.
Right. Here you can see the burlap structure.
Mm.
And, this is you and John in the gallery space, to give people a sense of that space. Of course, you'd been, so the first show, if we go back to the first show here in June of 1969, so you'd been in Toronto for a couple of years. And you had actually kept yourselves busy with a different project first of all, working with children. Could you tell us a little bit about that, and what's the Baldwin Street Club?
Well, the kids decided that it was the Baldwin Street Club because it was like their clubhouse. And I'm still in touch with many of these kids. And they were big families. There was one family, which is some of the kids in the lower corner, that had 14 kids. The mom had won a prize for having the most kids in 10 years. She had 3 sets of twins, so she had 14 kids in 10 years. And another family, there were 10 kids. So between those two families, we were kind of off to a start to do a project with kids. And photography was part of it. These kids were in opportunity classes, which were not giving them much of a sense of an opportunity. They were just sort of a dumping ground where they could put kids that weren't learning properly. And so I had worked with Head Start in Washington, D.C. in high school and summers. And so I had a certain idea of things that we could do. And they certainly took to the photography. They took pictures at their school, of their family, of their brothers and sisters, and quite documented their lives. And then we recorded them, the feeling that went with the pictures and their stories, and then we typed it up for them. but the kids took to the typewriter so fast, even though some of them were 7, 8 years old and really hadn't learned to print. The typewriters were an absolute hit. So we ended up with 8 or 10 typewriters, and they would come in, these heavy, heavy typewriters, and just sort of plot down on the floor right in front of the shelf and type. So I think that we probably had more success in terms of actually teaching them to read and be interested in writing through the typewriters and the writing. But they did illustrate, and we put out a newsletter called the Baldwin St Club, and they illustrated the cover. And we had an offset printing press in the back of the gallery and 3 sheds that were actually kind of out in the backyard. And so we printed the newsletters on our printing press, and we had donated paper from a printing company on King Street. And then the cameras were donated by the National Film Board.
Wow. I've got a couple of pictures here that were made by some of the kids in the program, just to give a sense. And do you want to tell us anything about either of these 2 photographs? Or
well, there were quite a few fires, and the kids were fascinated by fires, and the kids also sometimes they had been accused of attempting. I don't think they ever started a fire, but they did go and buy matches and had sort of a little bit of an intent after seeing these fires. So we had many discussions about that, and they didn't, as far as I know, start any fires. But
so you got one.
Charlie in the background of this picture brushing the dog is the one who introduced me to just about everybody in the neighborhood, because he would just had to know who was moving into the house, and he loved that dog. So he would come and brush the dog and just lie with the dog. And I'm still friends with that family. And I photographed the graduation from high school. I photographed one of their weddings, went to their 50th party when they turned 50, and have still stayed in touch with them.
So it was a tight-knit community, and photography, it seems, was just part of life, as well as living on the street. Living on the street, I was going to say, but I mean living on Baldwin Street. Photography just seemed part of things. Am I right about that?
Yes, it did. Yes, it did.
I'm just highlighting here one of your presumably printed by you posters.
No, this one we actually had professionally printed because it's bigger, and all our paper was smaller, and I wasn't very good at printer. But I mean, eventually Robin Williams came along, who was quite talented as a printer and did all the printing.
Nice. So you did, in fact, also occasionally do exhibitions of the children's photographs in the Baldwin
Yes,
Street
we did.
Yeah.
In the Baldwin Street Club, we regularly put their photographs up on the wall. And some of them were exhibited at Harborfront. We did an exhibit at Harborfront of children's photography, and the kids were able to, and that was a few years later than this, put their work up, and we mounted it, on rag board and made it look very professional. So it was fun, and they enjoyed it.
That would have been in the photo, what was known then as the photo passage at Harborfront Center.
Yeah.
A wavy hallway, but
yes,
photographs
no
like
humidity control.
Yeah.
And they actually left it unlocked and open at night, so nobody stole anything. It was actually quite beautiful space.
Excellent. So we have a few pictures here. These are pictures you made just of the street, of Baldwin Street, of life intergenerationally, as you observed it. I'm thinking about the angle here, actually. Are you standing under the front stoop of the gallery, in fact, looking
Actually,
down?
I'm looking out the second floor window down.
Yeah, so you could really...
And Charlie, who's leaning over, he worked for Silverstein Bakery until he retired. And the little person whose name I can't remember, her family is still in touch with me.
Oh, wow.
I had I'd kind of forgotten about this picture, but it's one of my favorites really, because it captures the fact that here's a man unrelated to this little child, and is just they're so open to each other. I wish the man wasn't smoking, but other than that, I like this sense. And that's really partly what the community was about, that there was this feeling of not a division between other people who also lived on the street.
Of course, occasionally there'd be street festivals. I love the sense of energy here, and also a sense of kind of quieter moment, but people gathering again on the street. That seems very much par for the course. And as you mentioned, the sort of the diversity of the community, I think, is immediately evident here. And the storefront that everyone is sitting outside is also a relatively new business that opened around the same time, right?
Yeah, it did open at the same time. Ragnarok leather store, a yellow Ford truck, which is kind of a head shop, and Whole Earth food store, all were people who kind of knew each other and lived on McCall Street. There were at least 3 houses that people seemed to navigate from one to the other, and it is quite thoroughly documented on Ragnarok's website. At this point, some of the people stayed in Canada and some went to the US, but there's some thought now that our stores were with the Cosmic Egg as well. And the woman who runs the Cosmic Egg is with her child.
And that was a used clothing store.
Yes, and it was a used clothing store, and it was new to Canada because other people were coming and saying, well, where did you get your clothes and how did you do it? And starting other locations. And she was actually getting the clothes from across the street at the Jobbers, that you could go in and buy clothes by the pound. And he had 2 buildings where you could walk from one to the other and would be constantly sorting things. So that's where they were going. And the man who ran that was very helpful to them. And her husband is sitting here with his pensive expression.
Right, with his legs crossed.
Yeah.
Well, and it's, of course, when I think about used clothing stores, certainly at least when I moved to Toronto in the 90s, the place to go was Kensington Market. But from, I think from what I'm gathering, this is before Kensington Market had that as a concentration of businesses.
Yes, it was before. And even in terms of the health food stores were really just starting around then. And so that people did come to look at what the businesses were and how they were, because they had read about them. And to have Americans come here, of course, we knew these stores from the US, even the used clothing stores and the whole secondhand movement, because here it was, the Sally Ann and Goodwill and that type of place to get used clothes in the early 60s, but early 70s, late 60s and early 70s. But now it is very, very accepted and very widespread. So that's Mrs. Berry, who had the 14 kids in 10 years.
Wow, that's extraordinary.
Yeah.
I'm very struck by the vitality you capture in these photographs. I've had already one question from one of our listeners who's asking where these photographs live. And of course, these are part of, these are pictures that you made, these in particular, but Laura, you also, along with one of your sons, steward the whole group of the pictures that you and John Phillips made in and around this time, from before you came to Canada, and John photographed in Selma and along in the civil rights movement, and you photographed, and we'll come to one of your projects shortly. But they are with you, right? And they
Right. We scanned some of these that we scanned for the documentary that's on the CBC, and some of them I think we might have scanned for you. But they're all at my house.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. You are the trove. In many ways.
Now, some of the poor people's campaigns have been sold, and there's probably 200 that are already that were waiting for a museum in the States to see if they had the funding. And I haven't heard from them for a while, so I'm not sure what's happening with it, but I don't have those. But other than those, they're all sitting in my house.
Wow. Okay, well, you mentioned the Poor People's Campaign. We're going to come back to that. But before we do, this very funny looking thing, I'm going to share a different screen so that we can take a look at a short video clip. Hang on. Sorry for the delay here. A short video clip from 1971. Just a moment here. Okay.
We photograph what we're involved in, what we believe in, and what we really care about. One of the things we care about is the neighborhood we live in.
We don't like to take pictures of people. We want them to somehow give us their images, and this comes through mutual respect. So we try to get people's permission to photograph them, and we return to them a few days later with a print that they can keep, and a chance to tell us not to use the photograph at all if they feel it misrepresents them.
We see photographic prints as historical documents and not just as art objects. We also think it's important to record the significant events in our own lives, such as the birth of our son. And significant events in the life of our street.
But our neighborhood is disappearing. Some of us are trying to save it. And even if we fail, we hope that our photographs will be a reminder of the community that has existed here.
That would, excuse me. Sorry about that. Hang on.
Hello, everyone. I'm Baldwin St, welcoming you to the Future Work Pioneers podcast.
There we go. Sorry about that, everybody. That was a bit of a sonic wake up. So that short clip film was created for TV Ontario in 1971. There's so many reactions I have. But how does it seem to you looking back at it now?
Well, I had thought we should cut off the end because the hydro block was saved and they did not build the 18-story transformer station. Now, some of the buildings had already been torn down, so there wasn't anything that could be done about those. But then they tore more of them down and built city housing. So that was a very good use of the property, and they maintained some of the old historical houses on Beverly Street. So that was a success that not only involved the Americans who were, have some talent in terms of protesting, but the local people. So the family with the 14 kids actually moved in and refused to leave. They actually were in a shelter. Their house had caught fire. And so them being able to stay in the neighborhood was very important to them. And it was a very visual statement as well that housing was desperately needed.
I'm so struck in how you talk about the importance of photographs for history, but also there's a sense too, and this might seem paradoxical, that they're also for now, that they are about life now, but for history. So this kind of tension between the two, but going back and looking at this so many years later, I feel it seems the impression that, or life as you lived it anyway, or the impression you might have wanted to relay seems clear to me somehow. It seems that something comes through that's very distinctive about that time and place. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to share my screen again, and we want to talk about your photographs for a moment. So, and I have a number of them here in the slideshow. This is from the Poor People's Campaign, which took place in Washington, D.C. in the spring of 1968, really a month after Dr. King was assassinated. So you had already established yourself in Toronto, but you went back to D.C. for this. What drew you back? And why was it important to photograph?
It was important to me because of the combination of poverty being the main issue. So it was bringing in many, many issues. And the idea was they really did not want it to be a middle-class church dominated where people came and then went back home and weren't doing anything. So it was an idea, it was Martin Luther King's idea. And I met the woman who, and I can't remember her name now, who took the idea. It was Robert Kennedy and another person who pursued it and wanted to bring the poor people to Washington, D.C., because otherwise the people would never go to Mississippi or Georgia or, California, where the grape workers, they would never go there. So it was a way of bringing the poor to Washington. And there were teach-ins, there was nonviolent training, lobbying Congress, just many, many, many activities that were going on. Martin Luther King had been given a permit. It cost about $26,000, so he wasn't really given a permit, but it was a process that many times people aren't given a permit. And these shacks housed almost 2,000 people for 6 weeks. And it rained. It felt like it rained every day. It didn't really rain every day, but it rained enough that the water never seemed to quite disappear. And there were different groups. There was a contingent of Native people who were taking on the issue of land rights, and that was their main issue that they wanted to focus on during the 6 weeks. But there were conflicts between one group or another, and this was called Resurrection City with these shacks. They stayed in a private school where they were offered space in a private school, Hawthorne School, and so they moved in there, just in classrooms and wherever they were going to put them. And the people, I spent a lot of time with the Appalachians and with the Black Southerners. And that's kind of a group that interested me, having lived in North Carolina and West Virginia, so that I felt like I wanted to know more about their stories. I'd lived in Columbus, Ohio, and suburban Washington. So there were lots of other people I had come into contact with in the past and knew in the past, but the Appalachians were a group that I was interested in.
So you spent the full 6 weeks in DC with the campaign.
I actually did go back to Toronto a couple of times. Now, part of the time, a friend of mine, a former teacher who was one of Martin Luther King's assistants, he was writing a book about the Poor People's Campaign. And so he had Henry and Steve and a few people, and I wasn't included in that group, but I was staying with them part of the time. And my mother was living in downtown in Washington. So some of the time I would go to her place, and some of the time I slept here on the sidewalk in front of the agriculture building. And this is the Minister of Agriculture going into work early in the morning. And I think you have a picture that maybe you have that is of the woman who woke me up in the morning to make sure I got this picture. And he was very cooperative. He was a very good guy. Food stamps are his responsibility. He tried to do a lot more than he was able to do. Otherwise, people wouldn't have just sort of let him go into work, and he would have probably come in through a tunnel, because there's many tunnels in Washington.
Mm-hmm. That's what a thing to witness. And of course, after Dr. King was assassinated, it's Reverend Abernethy who kind of takes up the charge and sort of continues on with the campaign so that it still goes ahead. This is perhaps towards the end of the campaign, at the end of 6 weeks, because it was in the end quite sort of violently broken up.
Yes, this is the last day, and about 300 people were non-violently arrested, because it was planned ahead of time with the police that they were going to leave the encampment. The permit had run out by more than a month at this time. And so people were really, really wanting to be able to leave. You know, you don't want to be there when it gets cold. So they were, they planned it, they trained for it, and they had city buses as well as police buses to arrest people. Now, Ralph Abernathy did stay in jail for quite a few weeks. Some people were just let go. And then the people who refused to leave the encampment, the police went in violently with tear gas and with their billy clubs and basically cleared out the place.
I'm struck by how close you are in this photograph, and close to the action, central to what's happening. I can imagine in an encampment with more than 3,000 people or so, and so many different activities happening. I think I have another picture here of it, a teach-in or a rally. We have James Brown and Jesse Jackson here in the center. How do you know where the action is? How were you finding your way?
Well, you met in the tent in the morning, and not everybody came, but once they would make an announcement, they would make the loud announcement what was going to go on. But there was a lot of sort of ad hoc people deciding to do whatever they wanted to do. So if somebody decided they wanted to block the traffic in front of the White House, they would take it up with a bunch of people. And if they could find enough people, they would just go and do it. So there was a lot of not planning that went on, as well as there was one day that was called the Ministers' March, and ministers came and had a march on Solidarity Day, June 19th. There was a mass demonstration. But the day to day, they would announce, you know, Stoughton Lind, I think he came, he was a leader, anti-war person as well. And he would stand, and if it was sunny, he'd be outside. But in the morning, they had these announcements and plans and what was actually scheduled.
But you were clearly immersed in and found yourself immersed in the life, even though you might have left and come back to Toronto and gone back to DC again. It seems like you found a way to be in the thick of it, perhaps much like you did on Baldwin Street.
I did. I actually had thought of myself initially as an observer, but that didn't actually last very long, because I did get to know people. And because I had nonviolent training, it just was so important to me, and I wanted to be a part of it. Even if I wasn't a photographer, I would have wanted to be a part of it. But I also did want to document it.
People are, of course, coming back to you for these photographs now, so many years later. This is the National Civil Rights Museum in Atlanta a couple of years ago, but you also have works in the collection of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., and you were part of the inaugural presentation there. What does it mean to have people see these, come back to you for these pictures 50 years later?
In some ways, it feels more important now than before.
Why?
And I think that the message of nonviolence, I mean, I felt heartbroken watching January 6th in Washington. I love Washington, you know, it's a beautiful city. And some of my favorite places, the Library of Congress, you know, I always go there and still have my library card and get it renewed so I can always go in. And so I think that message, and many people have forgotten, because it was so hard with Robert Kennedy getting assassinated and Martin Luther King getting assassinated and other people even before the People's Campaign who were assassinated, that many people did not expect to live. So in participation, they felt they were giving their lives. And of course, some did. But I now have the photos were also at the American History Museum. And that one, I'd never been in an exhibit that was exhibited so beautifully and thoughtfully and understood everything that was going on. And they also had the FBI footage because it was 50 years and it was open and people could
Wow.
use it. And Smithsonian, being a museum, could certainly have access to it.
Mm.
So they did. And so they picked out footage that none of us would ever have had, because they videotaped and photographed every single person
Right.
who walked into the encampment. They had a fence around the entire encampment, and so there was only one way to get in and one way to get out, and it was right by the Parks Department. And so they just photographed everybody and had tremendously interesting, and from the air as well as, you know, from the entry, so that anything you could want to know about it seemed to be documented quite thoroughly. But the
Yeah.
way they presented my photographs also were thrilling. I in 2008, I had 104 photographs in the Sumner Museum, and it was a solo show on this topic. And we had left it framed because of expectations and discussions in terms of they didn't know where it would be, but I would come back in 2018. So in that meantime, the African American History Museum was open. It wasn't finished on the opening day, so I had a slide presentation that was at that museum. But then the full exhibit was at the National American History Museum. And they put over the giant James Brown in a tent, they actually put the a tent
Oh, wow.
similar to the one in the picture on the wall, and then had the sound of rain coming down on it. And so they had found through lots of different photographers images that matched exactly what they wanted to say, so that they hunted for specific pictures that went with political signs that they had collected. When it was all torn down, Smithsonian went in and picked graffiti and interesting posters and things that were left behind, put it in a warehouse, and 50 years later they pulled it out and it was part of this exhibit. So they actually did a search with many photographers, including myself, to get things that matched what they already had.
Yeah, what a project. I've yet to visit that museum, but I will look forward to doing so sooner than later, we hope. I want to shift gears again and go back to Baldwin Street for a moment, and to the gallery, of course, that you and the exhibition program and the artists that you showed. Of course, you exhibited your own work, but most of the time you were exhibiting other people's work. So we see here, of course, the original 23 Baldwin Street, and then beside 38 Baldwin Street, which came a little bit later. And actually, you can see Laura. I think that's you inside just inside the door, doing something, I think. And here's just a few of the invitations to some of the shows. Work by George LaGrady and Patricia Burke, Arno Maggs, Robert Minden, Barbara Astman. But you showed many Canadian photographers, many American photographers, and even historical photographers. Do you want to say a few words about the exhibition program and how you decided who to show and when?
Sometimes we were trying to actually have a plan and carry out a plan, but most of the time it seemed to almost work just as well to say, Arno would walk in, show us a few pictures, and we go, yeah, sure, that sounds like a good idea. And that seemed to be a lot of the way that it was done. And there were many people who were volunteering in the gallery. And then in the last few years, we had a apprenticeship program through the Ontario Arts Council and Centennial College and Humber College, where people were paid to work in the gallery through those programs where they would learn more. And though the people who volunteered sometimes would bring in people who they knew about. And there was a connection through the documentary photographers across the country.
Right.
And some became quite close to the gallery and participated, the people from Ovo magazine, for instance, and David Miller, Clara Guccia in Montreal. Clara we decided to have a juried show. We never tried that before. And she was one of the jurors. And she came to Toronto and helped decide, I think with Pam Harris, a group show.
Mm.
And Pat Bork worked in the gallery, and I think Barbara Aspin was probably a student at the time. It was a very popular place for students because we were 2 blocks from the art college.
Sure. I know, so George LaGrady, who's noticed as sort of at top center, has talked about this project, the James Bay, the Fort George and the James Bay Cree sort of documentation project he did in 1973, and he talked about that he showed it a few times, but by far in his estimation at this moment, the most important show he did was for the Baldwin St Gallery, because the program you had was really about social documentary, that it had a sort of social conscience and an attempt to, think about the world and, I don't know, like you could say maybe activist terms, or at least for a way of kind of sort of socially progressive way. Would you agree with that as a description of the program?
Yes. I was trying to look at that, but I don't have my glasses on. But I was sort of thinking, is that George LaGrady's? So that's a very good comment. I was so impressed by the work that was done at the time by so many people who cared about what they were photographing. Mm-hmm. They weren't just going out and trying to get a shot that was unique. They wanted to express what was known. And that's true with Robert Minden as well. In his photographs, he was very much a documentary social justice person.
You've sent me so many wonderful flyers. I couldn't include them all, so I'm going to, that was just a small selection, but here we have an installation view of Barbara's show in 1973. You can see I guess this is the burlap structure that you could pin to. I'm also struck by all the books above. You sold books as well. Is that right?
Yes, that is right. Okay. Yes.
We'll come back to that. Another view of the installation. You can see more books through. That leads me to kind of ask about the business of the gallery. Could you make a go of it selling photographs and books?
The only things that were actually, you could say, were profitable were rare photographs that someone would ask for something and we would hunt for it or hunt. We in the end started buying camera works for ourselves because we liked them. But the first one that we sold a whole issue because the person was hunting for a whole issue.
Right. And this is the Alfred Stieglitz's journal camera work.
Yes.
Gorgeous.
They were beautiful. And we did do a display of the camera works, but then we were getting, attached to them. And stopped selling them. And then every once in a while, we take a few more out. But mostly it would be because I wanted to have all of Annie Brigman's, who was my favorite, and she was completely unrecognized. But they're on Japanese tissue, you can see through them. They're very thin, very fine. And I particularly love hers. And others, I like and I appreciate, but so I did end up selling more in order to be able to get more of what I wanted, to limit my collection more to collecting women.
It can be an occupational hazard coming into contact with all the wonderful work. So yes, I'd say a lot of the flyers that I chose were of living artists, contemporary photographers, but you did, of course, do shows of the work of Eugene Atget and Margaret Burke-White, and there's another just installation view. I love this view of the space. And do you remember what exhibition this might have been?
Gee.
It's hard to tell. There's balloons,
I think
actually.
it's Bob Openshaw's Whitefish Bay, Native people of Whitefish Bay. And he actually brought people down from Whitefish Bay to see the exhibit, to see themselves. And this exhibit was enlarged with bigger images after it was here and went to the ROM and was an exhibit, was displayed there. But it was, he did an excellent job, and this was a nice space because it was bigger and he could really spread out the images. It was quite a popular exhibit.
And here we have Barbara Morgan, who was, this is in 1979, so it would have been one of the, towards the end, because the galleries closed in 1980, but 1979, so it would have been one of the last shows you did. But Morgan is here in the center talking, and you know, it seems as a photographer, as a genre of work, it actually seems quite different in some ways to what you'd shown before. What tell me why Barbara Morgan at this time?
I loved her work of dance and the movement, and also her creativity, which grew on me over a period of time, where she would do montages, and I think I've kind of copied her work in this last pandemic of doing things that I didn't quite even realize I was being influenced by her. And my son is down in the lower left-hand corner, that curly-headed little person. And that's Vince Pietropolo, who's standing on the left.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah. And so, and then when I met Barbara Morgan, I went to her house and with my son, and she sat and played with a beach ball in her yard, sitting on the ground at this age, her age, throwing a ball back and forth with my son. And I just thought, this is an amazing person. And to see her studio, she lived in her studio, and pictures everywhere. And it just, I had already owned a couple of her books, and many that her family, Morgan & Morgan Publishing, had published. But I really wanted to do the exhibit, and I was delighted that not only did she bring enough for the whole gallery, but she brought lots of extra to show people. And
is that what's on the table here?
Yeah,
stacks of frames.
Yeah, and it sold very well, her exhibit, so I was delighted with that too. And she did a slide presentation of her work in an evening, and we just put out folding chairs and a projector, and she showed them.
It's kind of a wonderful moment in time when so many, I suppose as the field is getting going, that so many of the greats were still, of the 20th century greats were still alive, and you could knock on the door and work with them. I think about, okay, I'm just conscious of time here. So I will say, so you clearly had, you were selling books, you were doing shows, you were of course entranced by the work, but you're trying to also, well, keep things interesting. And I don't think you're one to sit still much. I'm just showing here quickly this flyer for Inner Life, Pictures of a Downtown Community, which was a collaboration with the City of Toronto Archives. So all of a sudden you've kind of established enough that the City of Toronto comes to you and asks about working together on a show. And the other is a flyer for Mind and Sight Gallery, which though is not the Baldwin St gallery, was still a gallery that you ran because you found there was funds for new galleries, not for existing galleries, but for new galleries. So you went ahead and started yet another gallery space. Talk about the hustle a little bit, just briefly.
Well, Mind and Sight had more, I think pretty well all established photographers. And it was very competitive. And we did do workshops. David Heath came once a week to look at people's pictures and comment on it. And there were some good programs. Very few people ever came in. And it was I put up a piece that was 200 photographs from tiny little to big, to 11 by 14. Some of them were contact sheet size. And it was a collage of Young Street and consumerism and the way that women were used for advertising. And it wasn't, I don't think anybody who saw it understood it at all for what I was trying to say. In fact, a couple of people said, hey, those are good businesses to be in. With all the, and the Santa Claus parade with this in front of the stripper places was part of the photos. So I didn't really quite fit into Mind and Sight. I fit in completely with our, kind of loose Baldwin high quality, but not quite as competitive as Mind and Sight.
Right, rigorous, quote unquote. Thank you for that. I know that it seems clear from the conversations we've had that you showed, Baldwin Street Gallery showed a lot of women working in photography at the time. Here are three from early days: Judy Gwynn, Marianne Bancroft, and Pamela Harris. And that kind of an interest in, you are a feminist, you were on the board of a women's place, you've worked in women's issues, amid kind of part of the women's communities for your whole life. And in fact, in the basement of the Baldwin Street Gallery, you had some dark rooms, and one of them was reserved for women. And would you say a few words about why that was and what came out of that?
I'll just point out that Pam Harris and Marion Bancroft both worked at the gallery and were part of, for quite a few years, it was run by women. And we were making the decision because John was making films and was more involved in doing films than he was in still photography for a period of time. But I've forgotten your question. Sorry, I interrupted myself.
That's okay. It was about the dark room in the basement.
The dark room. Yes, the dark room. Some women came into the gallery and were complaining about the fact that the U of T only had dark rooms for men. And it was because the U of T campus that was near our gallery, just, on College and north from there. And the darkroom was in Hart House, and Hart House was funded based on, I think, a inheritance, or I don't know what the word is, but it was a men-only building, and that's where the dark rooms were. So I set up a second dark room. It was actually a third dark room because we already had two, for women to use. We left the door unlocked and they could come and go as they pleased. The idea was that we wanted people to help pay for paper, but some people did, some people didn't. And that worked out okay because they were fine. They behaved nicely and produced bodies of work. And sometimes we would put them up at the gallery, and sometimes they were just doing work for themselves.
And out of that grew a group of women that sort of loosely, I think the name has changed a little bit over time, but as you told it to me, the Women's Photography Cooperative.
Yes. The Women's Photography Co-op was 8 women, and we put together an exhibit that was part of International Women's Day, and it would have been one of the first, among the first Women's Days that were occurring. And so we put together this photographs of women by women. And it first went to the U of T. We didn't get a grant. We just paid for it ourselves, mostly Pam Harris and myself. And we worked out of Pam's home and the gallery. And we had, the Village Voice claims in New York that we had over 1,200 submissions. And we did have a lot, and that was because the Village Voice wasn't just for New York, it was read in all over the US. And so people quite quickly just packaged up their work and sent it to us. There were 4 women who participated who were in the family of man. So at the time, we had always thought it was kind of that we were targeting young photographers and student photographers. But actually, it was years later that I was looking at the family of man and realizing that there were 4 women who had participated who were already had been in an exhibition that was in the 1950s.
Yeah, so participation in that big popular show, MoMA, and traveled around the world, most seen photography show ever by some measures, still wasn't enough to launch a career, right? So you,
no, it wasn't enough.
Yeah,
it wasn't enough. And it was the letters that came with it that were just so touching, from women telling about their experience as women photographers. Some were saying what the advantages were as well as the disadvantages, but there was this feeling on the whole that they were not going to get as far as their male counterparts.
A story that needs to be told at greater length, for sure.
The Image Nation is published by Coach House Press, and we were guest editors as a group of this particular issue, the 11th issue of Image Nation.
That's great. Well, in some ways kickstarts research that sustains you until today, the history of women working in photography. So the gallery closes in 1980, and you kind of move on to other work, but this remains a core part of what keeps you busy, this research. And so we have the Les Cahiers de la Femme, Canadian Women's Studies, and then this cover for the book that accompanied your exhibition, Rediscovery, Canadian Women Photographers, which came to the Art Gallery of Ontario in 1986 or 87. Maybe I will say this is a chat. It starts then. There's so much to say. You encourage, maybe we'll move directly to figures that were really totally under-recognized. Hannah Maynard, for instance, who was based in Victoria, BC. Maybe say a few quick words about Hannah, and then I'll want to talk about your current project right off the bat.
Okay. Hannah Maynard is now, I think, quite well known. She's being exhibited and there's a book about her. And she started by being taught photography while her husband was off hunting for gold. She was living in Bowmanville, Ontario. And when he came back, they moved to Victoria, and she photographed everything. It's like she photographed every school kid. She did the mug shots for the police. They would traipse the criminals down to her studio for her to do a mug shot, and they're quite human mug shots. They don't really look like they're always a mug shot. She was quite sensitive to them. And then she did these collages of herself. This is herself and her grandchild. And so she is working with a glass negative and creating these images, and they're just astounding. So I'm doing this pre-Confederation women photographers, and mostly I am talking about ones that are unknown. But because she learned in 1862, even though Hannah Maynard's most interesting work was later, I'm able to kind of keep her in my project. Now, this is an ad for Mrs. Fletcher. And Mrs. Fletcher, I'll just read you the sentence that interests me, that she is prepared to execute daguerreotype likenesses in a style unsurpassed by any American or European artist. This is 1842 in Toronto. Photography was announced in 1839. And she was, before she came to Toronto, she had already worked in Montreal and Quebec City. And she's writing that she also writes to enterprising young men. And a daguerreotype is the first commercially viable photographic process. And here is a woman when people did not think that women would ever take up the practice of daguerreotype. It's a very difficult process. In the 1840s, you would still be grabbing the neck in a bar and having to hold their neck into this brace in order to take the pictures. So it was difficult. Within a few years, they started having better lenses and the exposure got less and less. So it was less difficult to do. But the negative was a wet plate process. So you had to put it into the camera, dripping wet with chemicals. So it's not a process that you would expect women to do. But Mrs. Fletcher is talking about the process and that it is capable of providing an incomparably greater income for the, whoops, I do need my glasses, for the amount of capital invested in it than any other business, thus affording its possessor an avocation as agreeable and lucrative as can be wished by the mere expenditure of a mere trifle and a few hours application. That's 1842.
Yeah, this is amazing. I mean, I knew that Hannah Maynard, in fact, trains her husband, Richard Maynard, in how to make photographs. So I knew that and thought it was unusual. But we're now with your research, seeing this, we think, here's a Mrs. Fletcher who's like, I can train you in this business.
She later taught women, 2 ladies. She was hunting for 2 ladies. And this has been a very interesting process, even doing the research, because Ralph Greenhill had got me started into this process, and he had written a book on history of photography. And this is like, I call this Ralph Greenhill's camera, because Ralph Greenhill was a regular at the gallery, and he loved the topic of history of photography, and he had written several books on that topic. But one day he said, I'm taking you on a road trip. We're going to go and look at a camera. And I said, Ralph, I'm not interested in cameras. No, this camera, you have to have this camera. Bring your checkbook. So I agreed, and we went out, and it was not too far outside of Toronto, but it was in a barn on a farm. And there's this dirty old camera, but he said, no, I'll show you, we'll spruce it up, we'll clean it up, and we'll put linseed oil on it, and it'll look gorgeous. So anyway, I bought it, and it wasn't very much money, and he dragged it back, put it in the car, dragged it back. It has a tripod that's underneath that you can't see, but the whole thing is taller than me. So it's huge. So I did put it in the gallery, and I am very attached to it now. And but I've always referred to it as Ralph Greenhill's camera, because he was downsizing at that point in his life, and it wouldn't fit into the place that they had moved. It was much smaller than when they'd had a larger house. So he could not fit that camera. And so I agreed that if I did ever find that I had to sell it, that I would sell it back to him. Now that was about probably 30 years ago. Wow. And he has since passed on. But I do attribute a lot of my interest in history and photography to him, because it's the only topic I ever talked to him about, and he was quite willing to share his extensive knowledge and tell me how to go about finding out more about Mrs. Fletcher and about other photographers.
Well, Laura, I think we're going to need to do a part 2, because I still have so many questions for you, and there's so much more to share. It's just shortly after 5, so I think we're going to we're not going to be able to take any questions, but I do want to acknowledge that in the questions in the chat, there is so much love for the Baldwin St Gallery, respect for you, Laura, for your work, for the role you've played tirelessly with deep curiosity to, well, for the cause of photography, for the love of photography, really. So I just want to thank you for sharing this this hour with us about your life and the life of photography, and maybe we'll think about a part 2. And I want to hear about. I was going to say I want to hear about those conversations you and Ralph Greenhill had, but it sounds like they were maybe more one-way conversations. So,
yes.
But perhaps we should we can talk about the women that you're looking into from the mid 19th century. So with that, thank you again. Thank you all for listening today, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the galleries looking at photographs again very soon.
Thank you, Sophie. I really enjoyed it.